heard last week a story of a man called the Gerasene demoniac who was possessed by so many demons that he called himself Legion. We heard about how Jesus entered into where this man was, how Jesus brought grace and healing and cast those demons out into the pigs, who then ran off the cliff and drowned in the sea. And a few of us, at least, left this space wondering what on earth was going on with those pigs. Wondering what had happened, why those pigs had died, and why Jesus had acted in such a strange way. And thankfully, where we ended our story last week was not actually the end of the story. So this week we hear the second half of that strange story of the Gerasene demoniac, and we hear other voices raised asking that question, what about the pigs? So listen now to how the townspeople responded upon the news that this man had been healed and their pigs had been destroyed.
When the swineherds saw what had happened, they ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came out to see what had happened, and when they came to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone, sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. Those who had seen it told them how the one who had been possessed by demons had been healed. Then all the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to leave them, for they were seized with great fear. So he got into the boat and returned. The man from whom the demons had gone begged he might be with him. But Jesus sent him away, saying, "Return to your home and declare how much God has done for you." So he went away, proclaiming throughout the city how much Jesus had done for him.
We hear how the townspeople received the news that Jesus has come and entered into this man's hopelessness, loneliness, and despair, how Jesus has brought hope, relationship, and healing. Except this isn't exactly the news that the townspeople actually hear. Instead, they hear that this strange man with his 12 followers has landed on their shore after a stormy night at sea. He talks a little bit with that crazy demon-possessed man who hung out in their graveyard, casts that man's demons out into their pigs, causing the pigs to run off the cliff into the sea and drown in some sort of weird lemming-inspired fit. And this is not exactly good news that they hear. These townspeople weren't really rich folk. They lived in a small Gentile town called Gadara, which I just learned that Dick Crawford has actually been to, so talk to him after the service about that. Anyways, they lived in a small town called Gadara, a Gentile town that was about 6 miles off the coast of the Sea of Galilee. And so these Gentile townsfolk, like the Jews in Jesus' hometown Nazareth, they were poor. They were peasants. They worked the land to make money to pay the exorbitant Roman taxes, and with whatever they had left over, they tried to get by and take care of their needs. So although they had these pig herds, they weren't exactly eating bacon every day, as shocking as that might be to us. Their diet probably consisted of bread, olives, wine, lentils, and some seasonal vegetables. It wasn't that exciting. And so meaty pork would have been a really tasty treat for them. But they weren't raising these pigs to eat themselves. They were raising these pigs to sell to richer folk who could afford to actually eat meat occasionally. And so these pigs were in effect their nest egg. They were the savings, the income, the business of a lot of folks in this town. And they weren't really happy when they found out that these pigs were destroyed. It's not really a fun experience to hear that all of your savings, all of your income, all of your prospects for the future have just suddenly evaporated. And so we find that this Jesus, who in the first half of the story is so helpful, is so hopeful, is so kind and caring, in the second half of the story, kind of comes off like an inconsiderate nuisance. I find myself asking, how could Jesus, who preaches so much about caring for the poor, who was poor himself, how could this Jesus act with such disregard for these Gentile townsfolk suffering in their loss of the pigs and their income? Now, this isn't an easy question to ask of Jesus. It might feel a little uncomfortable. And the frustrating thing about this story is there's no escape route. There's no easy excuse that we can make for Jesus to say, no. It was okay, it was a misunderstanding, it was all fine, really, it was good. And so we really find that we have two options after asking this question. Option A, we can give up. We can say, well, Jesus acted in a mysteriously devastating way, in a way that doesn't seem to really offer grace or justice or mercy. And that's all we can say about it. Or option B, we can press on further into this story with the faith that this poor Jewish Messiah did act with grace and justice and mercy, and we just don't understand quite how. Now, frankly, option A is a heck of a lot easier. But if we just gave up, this would be an embarrassingly short sermon. And we would probably all leave a little frustrated at this frustrating Jesus. And so, as hard and obnoxious as it is, we press on. And we find that this is a passage that as we press on deeper and deeper into it, we come up with even more and more and more questions. Like, for example, why do these townsfolk seem to not even notice the miracle that has taken place before them? If whoever was in charge of it gave these townspeople the task of choosing the little header that comes before the Bible stories, I don't think that they would have given it the traditional title of Jesus Heals the Gerasene Demoniac. They might have instead called it something like that one time that guy came and killed all our pigs. They don't seem to notice the grace that has taken place. There are no hugs, no reunions offered with this man who has been isolated and ostracized for years. Instead, the only reaction that Luke tells us that these people had was they look at the whole situation of what's happened and they respond with fear. And go figure. They were probably afraid of, oh my goodness, how are we going to pay our taxes this year, let alone feed ourselves and our children? But still, even with so much on their plate, I would have thought that maybe someone would have noticed that this man is sitting there calm and in his right mind. I would have thought that a mother or a brother maybe would have stepped out of the crowd, ran over to the man, wrapped their arms around him, and rejoiced that this man who was hopelessly, violently possessed has been returned to himself. That he can now rejoin his friends and his family and live as a part of this community. These townsfolk don't see this miracle. They don't see this grace. They only see the cost of their pigs. And so they conclude that Jesus' presence is just too costly for them, and they kick him out. Now, we're good Christians. We evoke Jesus' name in prayer. We eat Jesus' bread, body, wine, blood every month at Holy Communion. We hang a cross as a visual reminder of Christ's death and resurrection. We rely on so much Jesus' presence with us. And so, surely we, as good Christians, wouldn't find that presence too costly. We wouldn't ask Jesus to leave. I find this passage very beautiful and at the same time very disconcerting. It's beautiful because these townspeople can make a really good argument about why Jesus' presence is just too costly. If you gave them half an hour, a computer, and a PowerPoint tutorial, they could come up with a really solid, convincing presentation about just why Jesus needs to leave, why it costs too much to have him here, complete with data and graphs and probably even clip art. They're very human. This is a very universal concern for counting the costs. How easy is it to see ourselves responding in the same way at this exorbitant cost? I myself, at the beginning of this sermon, responded in the same way, wondering about how this cost could be justified. And that's where, in the beauty of this story, it's also disconcerting, because we as Christians, as followers of Jesus, we rely on his presence for our very existence. He is the vine, we are the branches. He is the rabbi, the teacher, we are the disciples, the students. How can we follow Jesus if we think his presence is too costly in our lives? Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that probably none of us saw our pigs drown this morning. But that doesn't mean that we don't experience real, deep costs of God's grace and presence with us. It might be the cost of letting go of hurt and pain when we're called to forgive someone. It might be the cost of waking up early on a Sunday morning and giving up your lazy Sunday morning to come and worship in this community. It might be the cost of taking the time to love and be present with someone when you have 10,000 other things that you really should be doing. We know what it's like to experience the cost of God's presence. And so we hear yet another question arising out of this Bible story. How do we faithfully respond when we feel so deeply the cost? And frankly, I don't think our Bible story really answers that question. But it does point us towards another story that begins to offer us an answer. You see this account in Luke of Jesus going and healing a Gentile man is the only account in all of Luke's gospel of Jesus going and offering grace to a Gentile town. It's the only time that this happens. And so biblical scholars think that this story points towards another story that Luke wrote in his other biblical book of Acts. Thank you. The story of how the early church discerned a call to go, to take the message of God's grace to even the Gentiles. Now, at first glance, these stories really don't seem to have much in common. On the one hand, you have pigs and demons, and on the other hand, you have strange visions and angels and a sheep descending full of animals. We'll get there. And so it seems like the only things that they really have in common are that they're really weird and that they have Gentile actors. But when we read that story in Acts of that early church making the decision to welcome in Gentiles, when we read that with today's story of drowning pigs in our mind, we start to see some deeper connections, undercurrents of the deep felt awareness of the cost of God's grace, undercurrents of fear and trepidation at that cost. Luke starts his story in Acts with a man named Cornelius. And this Cornelius is about as different from our Gerasene demoniac friend as is humanly possible. He's well respected and looked upon in his community. He's a centurion, which means he's a commander of a large part of that vast, powerful Roman army. But he's not just well regarded by the Romans and by the other Gentiles, he's well regarded by the Jews in his community as well. They see him as a devout man, as a God-fearing man. He gives alms to the poor. He prays constantly. So the only similarity between this Cornelius and this demon-possessed man is that they're both Gentiles, but that is similarity enough. Despite all his other redeeming features, despite being devout, despite giving money to the poor, despite praying constantly, Cornelius is a Gentile, and so he's an outsider. He's put firmly outside of the community of God's faithful believers. Until one day, Cornelius has a vision. An angel comes down and says to Cornelius, "Hey, you may be on the outside, you may be a Gentile, but God has seen you. God has appreciated your faith. So go send some folks to this town 35 miles down the road and find this man named Peter and bring him back." And Cornelius is a believing kind of guy. And so he says, sure. He calls some of his soldiers and says, go on down to Joppa. Find this man named Peter. We don't know what he looks like. We don't know who he is. Just find him. Now Peter, our friend Peter, probably was very aware of the cost of being taken away by Roman soldiers. He had seen just how that had played out for Jesus when Roman soldiers came to the garden and took him away. So he knows the cost and the reality that these soldiers with their power can choose to kill and to torture him. We can imagine that he wouldn't be too happy about seeing these soldiers again, even though they're different, these soldiers that wear the same Roman armor. So it's a good thing that when these soldiers approach the house where Peter is staying, Peter's up there praying on a roof, and he gets a vision as well. Everybody gets a vision. He sees this sheep coming down out of the heavens. And this sheet is filled with all kinds of animals. All the animals that the law of Moses has identified as unclean. And he hears his heavenly voice inviting him to have a snack. Telling him, go ahead, Peter. Eat of these animals. But Peter's a good Jew, and he's not going to be tricked even by a heavenly voice. So he says, no. I know the cost of eating something that's unclean. I'm not going to go there, so he politely declines the invitation. And he hears another heavenly voice, rebuking him, saying to him, Peter, what God has called clean, you must not call unclean. And this is really very abundantly clear. Peter has no idea what this means. And so he's sitting and he's pondering what this could possibly mean for this early church. And just as he's wondering that, these Roman soldiers come up and knock on his door and say, "Hey, Peter, we're looking for you. We want to take you back to our buddy Cornelius, who's a Roman centurion." And we can imagine Peter probably has flashbacks of the last time he saw those Roman soldiers taking someone away. We can imagine Peter probably feels deeply the fear and the cost of what this might mean. But Peter hears the whispering of the Holy Spirit, telling him that something is happening that he doesn't understand. Telling him that despite all these appearances, he should go without hesitation. And so this Peter, who was so afraid of being taken by those soldiers with Jesus that he denied Jesus 3 times, this same Peter trusts in God's grace. He trusts that something is going on that he can't quite see, and so he goes willingly with these soldiers. And when he gets to Cornelius' house, he finds that indeed God's grace has been working some strange, weird, unseen miracles with this man. He sees how God, despite those categories of clean and unclean, has invited this unclean Gentile into a new life of forgiveness and grace through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And so Peter begins to preach about the grace that he sees in this place, the grace that he's experiencing right now. And the Gentiles hear Peter preaching, and the Holy Spirit falls upon them, not just Cornelius, but upon all the Gentiles there. The place is filled with the fiery presence of God, and it is clear to everyone that God has invited these unclean, outsider Gentiles into the community of God's faithful. Now, what does this story of Cornelius have to do with the pigs? What does it have to do with that first question we asked of why did Jesus act in such an obnoxiously strange and unaccommodating way? Well, we hear a profound message as Gentile Christians when we hear Cornelius' story. Because when Peter's Jewish friends heard about what he had done, heard that he had baptized and welcomed unclean Gentiles into their midst, they called him in for a performance review. And they said, "Peter, what the heck is going on? What are you doing? Don't you know that Gentiles are unclean? Don't you know that by inviting these Gentiles into our midst, you're making us all pay the cost of being unclean by association?" You see, these early Jewish Christians believed that if they even ate with a Gentile, they would be unclean by association. So imagine how dirty they would be if they lived in this communal, shared family life of discipleship with these Gentiles. It was not a good thing. So, yeah, Peter's actions might not have killed any of their pigs. They probably didn't have pigs. They were Jewish. But there was a steep cost for them to pay nonetheless. It might not have been a financial cost, but it was a religious cost. Because they believed that being unclean meant you were alienated from God. They believed being unclean meant you were alienated from Jesus Christ. And these are people who have given up everything to follow God, to follow Jesus. It was a hugely unbearable cost in their life to be separated from the one that they yearned to follow. And yet, although they're clearly very aware of the cost and a little angry at Peter, These early Christians responded very differently from our Gentile Gerasene townsfolk. They saw the cost. But they also saw the grace and the miracle when they heard Peter's story. And although they knew how much it would cost them, although they knew that it would cause strife and chaos and division and confusion in their community as they tried to figure out how on earth they were supposed to live together as Gentile and Jew believers, although it would become the hot-button issue of the early church, so many blog posts were written about it. It was amazing. Although it would be so controversial, these early Christians decided to trust in God's grace. Trust that the grace that they saw God pouring out on Cornelius would be poured out on them and their community as well in this time of turmoil and chaos. They fully lived into the miracle that they saw, in that they fully allowed their lives to change by witnessing this grace and this miracle. And we, as Gentiles, Gentile Christians, living 2,000 years after this decision was made, we see the fruit and the grace that has multiplied throughout the centuries and throughout the world. We look around at each other. Go ahead, look around. And we remember that we would not be sitting here. We would not be sitting here if they hadn't made the decision to welcome in Gentiles into their community. We look at the impact of this church community that our relationship with God has had on our lives. We look at the impact that this church community has had in our Livermore community. The hundreds of people who are fed, hungry people who are fed each week, the hundreds of people who are told each week, you matter. You are beloved. We look at these miracles that happen in this community, and we can trace them directly back to that decision to accept and to see and to live into the miracle of God's grace extended to Cornelius and to the Gentiles like us. We see how the fruit of grace transforms even the steepest of costs. And so we return again to our question, what about those pigs? Why did Jesus act in such a way that disregarded these people's real and painful financial hardships? And after going deeper into this story and the story of Cornelius, I find that my question has changed. Now I wonder, what would have happened if those townspeople had seen the miracle? What would have happened if those townspeople had seen that their pigs had died, but had also seen that this man was healed and had invited Jesus into their town, saying, what you did for him, do for us, do for our pigs. Give us something, some grace here. This is the Jesus who turned cheap, abundant water into expensive wine. He could have shut down this whole winery area. This is the Jesus who fed crowds of over 5,000 people with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. This is the Jesus who just cast out a stubbornly violent legion of demons from this hopelessly possessed man. And so I believe that this Jesus could have worked grace and miracle and even this situation of ruined pigs and destroyed savings and loss of income. I believe that this Jesus, who was himself poor, who understood what that life was like, who was constantly caring for the poor, who called them blessed. I believe that this Jesus would have cared for these poor Gentiles with transformative grace that transformed even the cost of their loss of pigs. But we will never know. We will never know. Because instead of seeing the possibilities of grace and the miracle, they saw the prohibitive cost, and they asked him to leave. So we'll never know what could have happened. We hear today 2 stories about the cost of grace. One story ends with dead pigs. The other story has not yet ended. It continues being sung throughout the ages. We experience it even in this moment as we, as Gentile Christians, experience the miracle of being welcomed and invited into God's church. We look around us. We see the fruit of this miracle, the fruit of this grace, and we are thankful that those early Christians chose to see the cost and to trust the grace. So how do we faithfully respond in our lives when we feel that deep cost of Jesus' grace? These stories remind us that although God's grace is freely given, it has lasting, costly implications for our lives. It changes our behaviors. It calls us to give up the hurt and the anger and the fear and to offer forgiveness. It calls us to give up comfort and our normal routine and to offer hospitality to folks who, like us Gentiles, might change the makeup of our community. It calls us to sacrifice our time and maybe our comfort and feel the call to be Stephen ministers. It calls us to sacrifice our time and to go work in the garden. It calls us to go work with Open Heart Kitchen, with many of the other spaces that this community has carved out to serve others with love. God's grace calls us to that transformative cost. And we find that when we live into that grace, when we allow our lives to be transformed and changed by it, that there is grace enough to transform the steepest of costs. We look around at each other here. Go ahead. Look around again. The last time. We look around and we see the mercy. We see the grace. We see the fruit of what it means to allow our lives to be transformed, to make that difficult decision, to hear the grace, to see the cost, and to allow ourselves to live fully into that grace. Amen.